You've spent 30 years saving for retirement. You've run the calculators. You've read the articles. And they all say the same thing. Withdraw 4% of your portfolio each year and your money will last. Whether you have $400,000 or $800,000, the advice is identical. Take out 4%, adjust for inflation, and you're safe for 30 years. You've built your entire retirement plan around this rule. And right now, that rule is quietly setting you up for failure. The 4% rule was created in 1994 by a financial advisor named William Bengen. It was built for a specific type of retiree in a specific economic environment that no longer exists. And if you follow it blindly in 2025, you're using a formula designed for someone retiring at 65 into 7% bond yields who dies at 80. But you might be retiring at 58, or you're facing bond yields of 4%, not 7%. Or you're likely living to 88, not 80. Or you just lived through 8% inflation when the rule assumed 3%. Charlie Munger understood something most people miss. Rules that worked in one environment become dangerous in another. The 4% rule isn't wrong because the math is bad. It's wrong because the assumptions underlying it no longer match your reality, and the difference between blindly following it and understanding its limitations is the difference between thriving in retirement and slowly going broke while thinking you're being prudent. Before we get into this, do me a favor. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's here. City, state, country, just let me know. This is where people with any portfolio size, whether it's $350,000 or $900,000, make a catastrophic mistake. They think the 4% rule is a safe withdrawal rate. But it's not a rule. It's a historical observation based on assumptions that no longer hold. And if you don't understand the difference between what the 4% rule was designed for and what your actual retirement looks like, you'll either run out of money at 82 or die at 88 with hundreds of thousands unspent because you were too afraid to adjust. Here's what's really happening. The 4% rule gives you a false sense of precision. It makes retirement planning feel scientific, predictable, safe. But retirement isn't a math problem with one answer. It's a dynamic system with changing variables. And treating it like a fixed rule guarantees you'll optimize for the wrong scenario. The people who retire successfully understand that withdrawal rates need to flex based on market conditions, age, health, and spending needs. The people who fail are rigidly following a rule that doesn't account for their reality. And the difference between these two groups isn't intelligence or portfolio size. It's understanding that the 4% rule is a starting point, not a finish line. You open your retirement calculator. You enter your portfolio. Maybe it's $450,000. Maybe it's $720,000. The calculator spits out a number. You can safely withdraw 4% per year. If you have $500,000, that's $20,000 annually. If you have $700,000, that's $28,000. Add Social Security, and you feel like you've solved the puzzle. The math seems solid, scientific, safe. Here's what you think is happening. You're following the proven rule. The 4% withdrawal rate has a 95% historical success rate according to the studies. You're being prudent, conservative. You're doing exactly what every financial advisor and retirement article tells you to do. But here's what's actually happening. You just locked yourself into a withdrawal rate that assumes you're a 1994 retiree retiring at 65 into an economic environment with 7% bond yields and dying at 80. You're not that person. Maybe you're retiring at 59. Bond yields today are 4-5%, not 7%. You're likely living to 87, 90, not 80. and you just committed to withdrawing the same dollar amount every single year for 30-plus years, regardless of what markets do, what inflation does, or what your actual spending needs are. Let me show you where this breaks. Take someone with $650,000 who retires following the 4% rule. That's $26,000 per year. Year one of retirement, markets drop 30%. That $650,000 becomes $405,000. But they still withdraw $26,000 because that's the rule. They're now withdrawing 5.7% from a depleted portfolio. Year two, markets are flat. They withdraw another $26,000 plus inflation adjustment, now $26,180. Year three, markets recover 15%, but they've been withdrawing from a reduced base for 2 years. The math never fully recovers. By year 10, they should have around $580,000. They have $410,000. The 4% rule didn't fail because the rule is wrong. It failed because they experienced sequence of returns risk in a low bond yield environment with a longer retirement timeline than the rule was designed for. Here's why this matters more than you think. The 4% rule gives you false confidence. It tells you that as long as you don't exceed 4%, you'll be fine. But that's only true if you match the exact historical conditions the rule was based on. And you don't. Nobody retiring in 2025 does. Most people don't realize what's happening beneath the surface. They see 95% success rate and think that means their specific situation has a 95% chance of success. But that's not what it means. It means that historically, across all possible 30-year retirement periods from 1926 to 1994, a 4% withdrawal rate succeeded 95% of the time. But those periods included bond yields of 5 to 10%. They included a 30-year retirement maximum. They included different inflation environments. Your specific circumstances matter more than historical averages. You did the 401k match, maxed the IRA, built your portfolio over decades, and now you're using a 30-year-old rule of thumb as if it's a law of physics. That's not prudent. That's dangerous. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that the 4% rule is inflexible. It doesn't adjust for reality. Markets crash, withdraw 4%. Markets boom, withdraw 4%. You're 75 and healthy with extra. Expenses? Withdraw 4%. You're 85 and sick with reduced spending? Still withdraw 4%. Your spending needs change. Your health changes. Market conditions change. But the rule stays frozen at 4%. That's not a retirement strategy. That's a recipe for either running out or dying wealthy while living poorly. Let me show you what Bengen actually discovered in 1994 and why it doesn't translate to 2025. Bengen looked at every possible 30-year retirement period from 1926 to 1992. He asked, what's the highest withdrawal rate that would have succeeded in the worst historical period? The answer was the 4%. If you retired in 1966, the worst time to retire in modern history, and withdrew 4% annually adjusted for inflation, your money lasted 30 years. Barely. That's where the rule comes from. But here's the mechanism nobody explains. The 4% rule worked in the worst historical period because of 3 specific conditions that saved it. First, bond yields. In 1966, you could get 5% on government bonds. By the early 1980s, bonds were yielding 10 to 15%. That high-yield period in the middle of the retirement timeline saved portfolios that were struggling in the equity portion. Today, bonds yield 4-5%. You don't have that cushion. The entire fixed income portion of your portfolio generates half the income it would have in 1966. Second, retirement duration. The 4% rule was built for 30-year retirements. Retire at 65, die at 95. But if you retire at 58, you need 35 plus years. If you're healthy at 62, you might live to 92. That's 30 years, but you're starting earlier with potentially a smaller portfolio. The rule doesn't account for early retirement or extended longevity. It assumes you start at 65 and end at 95. Third, inflation environment. Bengen's study covered periods where inflation averaged around 3%. We just lived through years of 6 to 8% inflation. If that becomes more common, or even if we settle at 4% instead of 3%, the 4% rule's inflation adjustments will deplete your portfolio faster than the historical data suggests. Now here's where it gets interesting. The 4% rule is actually a 3.5, a 5.5% rule depending on what happens in your first 10 years of retirement. If you retire into a bull market, 2010 for example, you can safely withdraw 5.5% because your early gains give you cushion. If you retire into a bear market, 2008 for example, you might only be able to safely withdraw 3.5% because your early losses compound through withdrawals. This is why you felt X when Y happened. When you ran the retirement calculator and it said 4% is safe, you felt relieved, but that calculator didn't know you're retiring into 2025's market valuations. It didn't know bond yields are at 4 out of 5%. It didn't know you might live to 90. It just gave you a number based on historical averages that may not apply to you. The math is this. Take a $600,000 portfolio at 4% withdrawal. That's $24,000 per year. If bonds, 40% of your portfolio, yield 4%, and stocks, 60%, return 8%. Average, your portfolio generates $9,600 from bonds and $28,800 from stocks before you touch it, total of $38,400 annually. Subtract $24,000 in withdrawals, and you have $14,400 in growth, which is 2.4% real growth on $600,000. That works if inflation is 2 or 3% and you're withdrawing at a steady rate. But if inflation runs 4%, you're adjusting withdrawals up to $25,000, then $26,000, while real growth stays around 2.4%, leaving almost no margin for error. Compare that to 1966. Bonds at 5 to 10%, call it 7.5% average, on 40% of portfolio, $18,000. Stocks at 10% on 60%, over $36,000. Total, $54,000 in growth on $600,000. Withdraw $24,000, you still have $30,000 buffer, 5% real growth. And the higher bond yields gave massive cushion. You don't have that today. The psychology insight is this. Humans want rules because uncertainty is uncomfortable. The 4% rule gives you certainty. I can withdraw $24,000 per year for 30 years. That feels safe. But that certainty is fake. You're trading actual safety for the feeling of safety, and those aren't the same thing. Most people miss what happens next. They follow the 4% rule religiously for years, watching their portfolio slowly deplete or stay stagnant, and then at 75, they panic. They either cut spending drastically, living poorly with plenty of money, or they keep withdrawing and run out at 82. Both outcomes come from the same error, treating a historical observation as a law. Here's the truth that contradicts everything the financial industry tells you. There is no universal safe withdrawal rate. The right rate for you depends on when you retire, what markets do in your first decade, how long you live, what bond yields are, and how flexible you can be with spending. The 4% rule isn't wrong. It's incomplete. It tells you the floor, the absolute minimum you should be able to withdraw based on historical worst-case scenarios. But it doesn't tell you what you should actually do in your specific situation. Let me show you the paradox. Two retirees, both with $600,000, both retiring at 65. Person A retires in 2009, right after the crash. Person B retires in 2007, right before the crash. Person A can safely withdraw 5 to 6% because they're buying into a recovery. Their early years are phenomenal. Stocks rebound 150% over the next 5 years. Person B can only safely withdraw 3.5% because their early years are catastrophic. Stocks drop 50% while they're withdrawing. Same rule, same portfolio size, same starting point. Completely different safe withdrawal rates. Why? Sequence of returns risk. The 4% rule averages out these scenarios and says 4% works on average. But you don't retire on average. You retire once at a specific time into specific market conditions. And your personal safe withdrawal rate might be 3% or might be 6%, depending on factors the 4% rule ignores. Here's something that surprised me when I really studied successful retirees. The ones who thrived didn't follow a fixed rule. They followed a dynamic strategy. In years when their portfolio was up 20%, they withdrew 5 to 6% and actually enjoyed life. In years when the portfolio was down 15%, they withdrew 3% and tightened the belt temporarily. They flexed, and that flexibility, that willingness to adjust based on reality instead of rigidly following a rule, is what kept them solvent for 30-plus years. The data shows something nobody expects. Variable withdrawal strategies, where you adjust spending based on portfolio performance, have higher success rates than fixed 4% strategies. Not because they withdraw less on average, but because they avoid the catastrophic error of withdrawing 4% from a portfolio that just dropped 40%. You might be thinking, but I can't just cut my spending by 40% in a bad year. Let me tell you why that doesn't work the way you think. First, you're not cutting from your base need. You're cutting from 5 to 6% in a good year to 3% in a bad year. If you have $500,000 and you were withdrawing $30,000, 6% in a boom year, cutting to $15,000, 3% in a crash year, feels dramatic. But you planned for this. You have Social Security covering base needs. The portfolio withdrawal is supplemental. Second, you're not doing this forever. You're doing it for 2-3 years while markets recover. Third, the alternative is running out of money at 78, which is worse, temporary belt tightening or permanent poverty. That's the trap. The 4% rule that feels safe because it's fixed is actually more dangerous than a flexible approach that adjusts to reality. But flexibility requires emotional discipline most people don't have. So they cling to the rule and feel safe right up until they run out. The situation changed. In 1994, bonds yielded 7%. Today, they yield 4 to 5%. In 1994, retirement meant 65 to 80. Today, it means 58 to 90. In 1994, inflation averaged 3%. Today, we're coming off 8% years. The rule didn't account for these changes because it couldn't. But you need to. So if the 4% rule doesn't work as a rigid guideline, what should you actually do? Not theory. Practical strategy you can implement regardless of your portfolio size. The answer is use the 4% rule as a baseline, but implement a flexible withdrawal strategy based on your specific situation. Here's how. You're 5 to 10 years from retirement. Stop planning around, I need X portfolio to withdraw 4%. Start planning around, I need a system that adjusts to conditions. Build your cash buffer first. 3 years of expenses minimum. If you need $50,000 per year, that's $150,000 in cash and short-term bonds. If you need $35,000 per year, that's $105,000. This buffer is what enables flexibility. When the market crashes in year 2 of retirement and you're supposed to only withdraw 4%, you don't. You live off the cash buffer and withdraw 0 from stocks. That's not in the 4% rule, but it's what saves you from sequence risk. Calculate your baseline needs versus discretionary spending. You need $40,000 per year to cover essentials, housing, food, healthcare, utilities. You want another $20,000 for travel, dining out, hobbies. Total $60,000. In a good market year, You withdraw the full $60,000 from your portfolio, plus Social Security. In a bad market year, you withdraw $40,000 and defer the discretionary spending. That flexibility is the difference between success and failure. For someone with $500,000 planning to retire, your 4% baseline is $20,000. Add Social Security of $24,000. You're at $44,000 total. That's your floor. But in good years, you can safely pull 5 to 6%. That's $25,000 or $30,000 from the portfolio. Your range is $44,000, $54,000 depending on market conditions. Plan your life around that range, not a fixed number. You just retired or you're retiring soon. The 4% rule would tell you to calculate your annual withdrawal and stick to it. Don't. Instead, implement a guardrail strategy. If you have $600,000 and 4% is $24,000, your guardrails are 3%, $18,000, and 6%, $36,000. In normal years, you withdraw 4 to 5%. If your portfolio drops below a threshold, say 15% below starting value, you cut to 3%. If your portfolio exceeds a threshold, say 20% above starting value, you increase to 5 to 6%. This does two things. First, it prevents you from depleting a portfolio during crashes. Second, it allows you to enjoy gains during bull markets without guilt. You're not trying to die with the maximum account balance. You're trying to maximize years of comfortable living. Social Security timing matters here. If you can delay from 62 to 67 or 70, you reduce pressure on your portfolio permanently. Every dollar of Social Security you maximize is one less dollar your portfolio needs to generate forever. Use your portfolio to bridge the gap. Let Social Security grow, then lock in higher guaranteed income. That's not in the 4% rule either, but it's critical. For someone retiring with $400,000, your 4% is $16,000 annually. That feels tight. But delay Social Security to 67 for $30,000 a year instead of claiming at 62 for $21,000 a year. Use your $400,000 to bridge 5 years, $80,000 total spent, leaving $320,000. Now, at 67, you have $30,000 Social Security plus $12,800 from portfolio, 4% of $320,000, $4,200 a year, or more sustainable than $16,000 plus $21,000, there's $37,000 at 62. The 4% rule doesn't factor Social Security optimization. You must. You've been retired for 5 to 15 years. Maybe you followed the 4% rule strictly. Maybe you didn't. Either way, you need to reassess. If you're 70 with the same portfolio you retired with at 65, you've been too conservative. You underspent. You can increase withdrawals. Your remaining time horizon is 15, 20 years, not 30. You can safely pull 5-6% and actually live. If you're 70 with less than 80% of what you retired with, you've been too aggressive or unlucky with sequence. You need to cut back temporarily, not forever, just until markets recover or you reach 75-80 when spending naturally declines. The decision framework here is, am I optimizing to die with maximum wealth or to live well through my remaining years? Most people optimize for the wrong goal. They're 75 with $700,000, pulling $28,000 a year, 4%, and living like they're poor. They should be pulling $35,000, $42,000, and enjoying their healthy years. The money is a tool. Use it. For someone who's 68 with $550,000, if you've been withdrawing 4%, $22,000, you're underliving. Your life expectancy is 17 to 20 years. At 5%, $27,500, or even 5.5%, $30,250, you're still fine. Front-load the spending to ages 68, 78 when you're healthy. At 78, if you're still thriving, you can reassess. But don't sacrifice your 70s to protect your 90s you might not reach. When you're deciding withdrawal rates, stop asking, what does the 4% rule say? Start asking, what does my portfolio performance, my age, my health, and my spending needs actually require? That's the framework. Dynamic, personal, reality-based. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Charlie, this flexibility sounds great in theory, but I'm 67 years old. I don't want to spend my retirement managing guardrails and adjusting withdrawals every year. I just want a simple number I can count on. Let me tell you why that thinking will destroy you. The 4% rule isn't simple. It's simplistic. And there's a massive difference. Simple means easy to understand and execute. Simplistic means it ignores critical variables that determine success or failure. Following guardrails isn't complex. It's checking your portfolio once per year and asking, am I within my range? If yes, spend normally. If portfolio is down 20% plus, cut discretionary spending temporarily. If portfolio is up 20% plus, spend a bit more. That's it. That's the complicated system you're worried about. Compare that to the 4% rule's simplicity. Withdraw the same amount every year, regardless of reality. Markets crash 40%, keep withdrawing. Markets boom 30%, keep withdrawing. You're 75 and healthy, keep withdrawing. You're 85 and sick, keep withdrawing. That's not a strategy. That's autopilot into a mountain. The people who succeed in retirement aren't the ones with the simplest rules. They're the ones who stay engaged enough to adapt when conditions demand it. And checking your portfolio once per year to see if you're within guardrails is infinitely simpler than panicking at 78 because you rigidly followed a broken rule. So don't confuse simple with effective. The 4% rule is simple. It's also dangerous. Guardrails are slightly less simple, but they work. Now, let me show you exactly what this looks like over 25 years. Let me show you what rigid 4% rule following versus flexible strategy looks like over 25 years. Two retirees, both 63 years old, both retiring in 2008, worst possible timing, right before the crash. Both with $500,000. Person A follows the 4% rule rigidly. They withdraw $20,000 in year 1, 2008, adjusted for inflation annually no matter what. Person B follows a flexible strategy. 3% floor, $15,000. 6% ceiling, $30,000, adjusting based on portfolio performance and market conditions. Year 1 to 3, ages 63 to 66, 2008, 2011. Markets crash, dropping 50% in 2008, 2009, then slowly recovering. Person A's $500,000 drops to $275,000. They withdraw $20,000 in 2008, $2,600 in 2009, inflation adjusted, $2,100 in 2010. They're withdrawing 6-7% from a depleted portfolio, locking in losses. Portfolio at age 66, $210,000. They're panicking. Person B's portfolio also crashes to $275,000. But they have a cash buffer built in, $45,000, 3 years at $15,000 floor. They live off the cash buffer, withdrawing zero from stocks in 2008, 2009. In 2010, as markets recover 15%, they withdraw $15,000 and replenish some cash. Portfolio at age 66, $285,000. They're calm because the system worked. Year 510, ages 68, 73, 2013, 2018. Bull market. Person A is still following 4% rule on their now $210,000 portfolio. That's $8,400 annually. They're living on $8,400 from portfolio plus $26,000 Social Security. Claimed at 63. Pile 34, $1,400. They feel poor. They're stressed constantly. They've had to move in with their daughter. Person B's portfolio recovered to $380,000 thanks to not selling during the crash. Markets are up 100% plus. From 2011 to 2018, they're withdrawing 5%, $19,000, plus $32,000 Social Security, delayed to 67, house $51,000. They're traveling. They're comfortable. The flexible system allowed them to survive the crash and enjoy the recovery. Year 15, age 78, 2023. Person A has $140,000 left. They're withdrawing $5,600 from portfolio, 4% of what's left. Total income, $31,600 with Social Security. They're living on bare minimum. They regret every rigid decision made in panic 15 years ago. Person B has $420,000. They're withdrawing $18,000, $10,000 to $21,000 depending on the year, 4 or 5%. Total income, $50,000, $53,000. They've lived well for 15 years and still have more than they need. Year 25, age 88, 2033. Person A has $45,000 left. They're terrified. Every medical expense feels catastrophic. They're dependent on children. The rigid 4% rule destroyed them, not because the rule itself failed, but because they couldn't adjust when circumstances demanded it. Person B has $200,000 to $80,000. They spent more, lived better, helped grandchildren, and still have substantial wealth. The flexible approach adapted to market conditions, life stages, and actual needs. Same starting point. Same market returns over 25 years. Same retirement timing into the worst crash in modern history. A $235,000 difference. But more importantly, 25 years of completely different life quality. Here's what this means for you right now, wherever you are in your journey. If you're 55 with $450,000, don't plan to withdraw exactly $18,000 a year forever. Plan to withdraw $13,500, $27,000 depending on conditions. If you're 65 with $700,000, don't lock in $28,000 a year. Plan for $21,000, $42,000 range. If you're 75 with $600,000, you can safely increase from $24,000 to $30,000 or $36,000 and actually live your remaining years. The decisions you make about flexibility versus rigidity in your 60s determine your reality in your 80s. The 4% rule gives you false precision. Flexible strategy gives you actual resilience. Here's the hardest part of abandoning the 4% rule. It requires accepting uncertainty as permanent, and humans hate that. The 4% rule is psychologically comfortable because it promises certainty. Follow this rule and you'll be fine for 30 years. That feels safe. That reduces anxiety. You don't have to think about market conditions or adjust your behavior or make hard decisions. Just withdraw 4% and you're good. But that certainty is an illusion, and the cost of that illusion is either poverty or underliving. The shift required is this: from seeking certainty to managing uncertainty. You need to accept that there is no safe withdrawal rate that works in all conditions. There's only intelligent adaptation to changing circumstances. For 30, 40 years, you optimized for accumulation. Save more, grow the balance, avoid mistakes. That was the right framework. But the moment you retire, the moment you switch from contributing to withdrawing, the framework changes completely. And most people never make that mental shift. In accumulation, rigidity works. Max out 401k every year no matter what. In distribution, rigidity kills. Withdraw 4% every year no matter what is the distribution equivalent of never adjusting your strategy. It's optimization for a world that doesn't exist. From rule following to judgment, the 4% rule lets you avoid making judgments. You don't have to decide, is this a good year to spend more or a bad year to cut back? The rule decides for you. But that's exactly the problem. Nobody else can make that judgment for you. Not Bengen, not a calculator, not a financial advisor. Only you know your health, your needs, your risk tolerance, your family situation. The shift is from outsourcing the decision to owning it. From fear to calibrated confidence. Most people cling to the 4% rule out of fear. If I withdraw more, I might run out. But that fear is destroying your retirement just as surely as running out would. You're 72 with $600,000, withdrawing $24,000, living like you're poor because you're terrified of the scenario where you live to 102. Meanwhile, the likely scenario, you live to 85, requires way more spending than you're allowing yourself. The psychological unlock is understanding that flexibility isn't reckless. Withdrawing 5% in a boom year isn't gambling. Cutting to 3% in a crash year isn't deprivation. It's intelligent system management. But you've been trained to believe that any deviation from the rule is dangerous. That training is what's actually dangerous. Once you make this shift, once you genuinely accept that retirement requires ongoing judgment rather than blind rule following, everything changes. You stop feeling guilty about spending in good years. You stop feeling deprived when you cut back in bad years. You stop checking your portfolio obsessively because you know the system adapts. You stop comparing yourself to people following the 4% rule because you understand they're operating with a broken framework. And you start living, which was the entire point of saving for 40 years. Remember what I said at the beginning. You've spent 30 years saving. Every calculator told you, withdraw 4%, and you're safe. You built your retirement plan around this rule, and that rule is quietly destroying your future. Now you know the truth. The question isn't, is 4% safe? The question is whether you understand that safe withdrawal rates aren't fixed. They're dynamic, personal, and dependent on circumstances the rule never accounted for. Because the 4% rule was built for 1994 retirees with 7% bonds and 30-year timelines. You're a 2025 retiree with 4% bonds and possibly 35-year timelines. The math is fundamentally different. So here's what happens next. Most people will hear this and do nothing. They'll keep following the 4% rule because it feels safe. They'll withdraw the same amount every year regardless of market crashes or booms. They'll either slowly run out because they couldn't adjust down in bad years, or they'll die wealthy because they couldn't adjust up in good years. And they'll never realize that the rule they trusted was the problem. A small group will hear this and restructure. They'll build cash buffers. They'll create withdrawal guardrails. They'll spend 5-6% in boom years and 3% in crash years. They'll delay Social Security to reduce portfolio pressure. They'll front-load spending to healthy years. They'll live well, weather crashes without panic, and maintain flexibility that makes them anti-fragile. Same market conditions, different system, different outcome. The difference isn't intelligence, it's not portfolio size, it's not luck. It's understanding that retirement is dynamic, not static. That rules from 1994 don't govern 2025 reality. That flexibility is safety, not recklessness. Retirement success doesn't belong to people who follow old rules. It belongs to people who understand the principles behind the rules and adapt intelligently, who build systems that flex with reality instead of breaking against it, who measure success by living well, not by dying with maximum account balance. The 4% rule works like this. It's a starting point that became a religion. The people who treat it as flexible guidance thrive. The people who treat it as law either go broke or underlive. That's how retirement withdrawals actually work. Your flexibility determines your outcome. Adapt accordingly. Now, if you want more brutal honesty about building wealth and achieving financial independence, timeless principles that actually work instead of get-rich-quick garbage, subscribe to this channel. We don't promise easy. We don't promise fast. We promise truth.